The bass string that broke the day Freddie Mercury died and why John Deacon never played again. How does silence sound when it's been your closest companion for 30 years? John Deacon knows. He's been living inside that silence since November 24th, 1991, when his musical partner died and something inside his instrument died with him. London, late November 1991, a few days after Freddie Mercury's death. The city moved through its ordinary rhythms outside the windows of John Deacon's home, people rushing to work, buses honking, life continuing with complete indifference to the fact that one of music's greatest voices had just gone silent forever. Inside a quiet room where winter sunlight filtered through curtains and illuminated dust particles floating in the air, John Deacon sat alone with his 1968 Fender Precision bass guitar. The same instrument that had created the iconic rhythm of "Another One Bites the Dust." The same bass that had started the heartbeat of "Under Pressure." The same strings that had vibrated beneath his fingers through thousands of performances and recording sessions. John held that guitar in his hands and tried to play one final note. Just one. A goodbye, maybe, or an attempt to fill the enormous emptiness inside him with the only language he'd ever truly mastered. His fingers found the strings. The metal felt cold against his calloused fingertips. He pressed down on the lowest string and plucked. The deep, chest-rattling note filled the room. But something was wrong. The sound came out and then just hung there in the air, searching for something to complete it, searching for the voice that used to answer. The 4-octave range that used to build worlds on top of those bass notes. But that voice was gone, and the sound John created had nowhere to go. Then something happened that John Deacon would later understand as a message. A sign that some partnerships don't end just because one person dies. They transform into something else entirely. The bass string broke, snapped, right there in his hands without any force applied. Just broke on its own as if it had been waiting for permission to stop working. John stared at that broken string, watching it curl back on itself, and understood what he had to do next. He would never play bass guitar again. Not for anyone. Not ever. This is the story of why Queen's quietest member chose silence, why he walked away from one of the biggest bands in rock history and never looked back, and why more than 30 years later, that broken string still sits exactly where it snapped, untouched in a corner of a room where music used to live. John Deacon had always been Queen's invisible foundation. While Freddie commanded stages like a lion ruling his kingdom, John stood slightly behind, providing the ground that allowed Freddie to fly so high. The bass lines he created weren't flashy or attention-seeking. They were essential, structural, the difference between a song and a great song. Freddie understood this better than anyone. He knew that John's seemingly simple bass parts were actually holding together the complex cathedral of sound that Queen built. The two men didn't need to speak much during recording sessions. John would play a note. Freddie would build a universe on top of it. They'd exchange a glance, move to the next section. The communication happened in frequencies beyond words. For nearly 20 years, this silent partnership had created some of rock's most enduring music. "You're My Best Friend," written by John, became one of Queen's most beloved songs. "Another One Bites the Dust," built on John's bass line, became their biggest American hit. "Under Pressure," recorded with David Bowie, showcased the iconic bass intro that almost got erased but John insisted on keeping. That bass guitar had been John's voice when his actual voice couldn't find words. In interviews, he'd been the quiet one, letting Freddie and Roger and Brian dominate the conversation. But on stage and in the studio, his bass spoke with absolute clarity and authority. The instrument itself had history embedded in every scratch and dent. A 1968 Fender Precision bass, chosen by John in the early days of Queen when none of them had money but all of them had ambition. He'd played it on every album, every tour. It had absorbed sweat from 1,000 performances and vibrations from countless hours in recording studios. The guitar knew Freddie's voice as intimately as John did. It had felt those vibrations, had responded to those frequencies. For 2 decades, that bass and that voice had engaged in conversation that millions of people witnessed but never fully understood. When Freddie Mercury died on November 24th, 1991, at approximately 7:13 in the evening at his home in Garden Lodge, the news rippled through the music world like an earthquake. Fans gathered outside the gates with flowers and photographs. Radio stations played Queen songs on repeat. The world mourned publicly, dramatically, with the kind of theatrical grief that Freddie himself might have appreciated. But John Deacon's grief was private, silent, contained in a room where no cameras could reach. In the days following Freddie's death, John existed in a strange fog. People called, letters arrived. The world wanted statements and appearances and participation in the public mourning. But John had nothing to offer the public. His grief lived somewhere deeper than press releases could reach. A few days after the funeral, John found himself alone in his home. The November afternoon light had that particular quality of London winter, pale and cold, filtering through clouds that never quite delivered rain, but never quite cleared either. He looked around the room at the instruments scattered in the corners and against the walls, guitars, a keyboard, equipment that had been essential to his identity for his entire adult life, all of it suddenly feeling like artifacts from someone else's existence. His bass guitar sat in its case in the corner, that familiar black case with velvet lining that had traveled with him around the world, to Tokyo and Rio and New York and Sydney, to every festival and stadium and arena where Queen had performed. John walked over to the case and opened it. The bass lay there, strings still tuned from the last time he'd played. Which was when? He couldn't even remember. Before Freddie got too sick to record. Before the world narrowed down to hospital visits and medication schedules and the slow, awful process of watching someone die. He lifted the bass out of its case, feeling the familiar weight settle into his hands. The wood was smooth and worn in places where his hands had gripped it for decades. The metal hardware showed the patina of years of use. This wasn't just an instrument. It was a companion, a tool, a language. John sat down with the bass resting on his lap. He didn't plug it into an amplifier. Didn't need to. The acoustic sound of an electric bass played unplugged was quiet but audible. Enough for this moment. He positioned his hands in the familiar configuration. Right hand near the bridge, ready to pluck the strings. Left hand on the neck, fingers ready to press down and create notes. The muscle memory of 30 years of playing made the positioning automatic, requiring no conscious thought. And then he tried to play. His right hand moved to pluck the E string, the thickest, lowest string that created the deepest notes. The string that anchored so many Queen songs. The string that had started Under Pressure and Another One Bites the Dust and 100 other tracks. His finger caught the string and released it. The note sounded, deep and resonant even without amplification. The sound filled the quiet room, vibrating in the air. But immediately, John felt it. The wrongness, the incompleteness. That note should have been answered, should have been met by Freddie's voice building something on top of it, should have been the foundation for something larger. Instead, it just hung there, alone, unanswered, a question with no response. John played another note, then another, each one sounding perfect technically but completely empty musically, like words spoken into a void where no one listens. He stopped playing, sat there with his hands on the instrument, feeling the silence press in around him. The room's clock ticked. Traffic sounds filtered in from outside. Life continued around him, while inside him something fundamental had broken. He made a decision in that moment. He would put the bass away. Not forever, necessarily, just for now, until he could figure out how to play without the other half of the conversation. John carefully positioned the bass back in its case, settling it into the velvet lining that had cushioned it through decades of travel. He was about to close the lid when his finger brushed against the E string. The sound that followed was sharp and metallic, a sudden snap that cut through the room's quiet like a knife. John jerked his hand back instinctively, startled by the noise. Then he looked down and saw it. The E string, the lowest, thickest string on the bass, had broken. Completely severed at the bridge, the metal cable curling back on itself, the tension released, the string dead. John stared at the broken string. His mind tried to process what had just happened through logical analysis. Bass strings don't just break spontaneously, they break from stress, from being played hard or being old or being tuned too tight. They don't snap from a gentle touch when they're not even under performance tension. But there it was, broken, curled back on itself like it had given up. John touched the broken end gently, feeling the frayed metal fibers. The string was relatively new, shouldn't have broken, had no reason to break, except that it had. And in that moment, sitting alone in his London home with winter light fading outside and a broken string curled in front of him, John Deacon understood. This wasn't random mechanical failure. This was a message, an answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. The bass guitar was telling him what he already knew in his heart but hadn't yet acknowledged in his mind. The conversation was over. The partnership had ended. The musical dialogue that had defined his adult life had reached its conclusion. You can't play bass for a voice that no longer exists. You can't create foundation for buildings that will never be built. You can't answer a call that will never come. The string breaking felt like permission, or perhaps a command. The instrument itself was releasing him from the obligation to continue, was saying what John couldn't yet say to himself: it's over. John closed the bass case with the broken string still attached. He didn't restring it, didn't repair it, just closed the velvet-lined lid and latched it shut. That was the last time John Deacon touched that bass guitar. November 1991, a few days after Freddie Mercury died, in a quiet room in London where a string broke and a partnership ended. In the months that followed, Brian May and Roger Taylor began discussing Queen's future. Not immediately, of course. Everyone needed time to grieve. But eventually, the conversation started. There was a tribute concert to organize. There were unreleased recordings to complete. There was a legacy to honor. They approached John carefully, knowing he processed things differently than they did, knowing he'd been the quietest member and might need more time. John listened to their plans, nodded occasionally, asked a few questions, and then, gently but firmly, said no. Not angry, not dramatic, just no. He couldn't explain it in a way they'd understand. How do you tell people that your instrument itself has told you to stop? That a broken string felt like a message from beyond saying the music was complete? Brian and Roger were confused. Hurt, maybe. They'd lost Freddie too. They were grieving too. But they found purpose in continuing the work, in honoring Freddie's memory through music. John found purpose in stopping, in honoring what had been by refusing to pretend it could continue without its essential element. The April 1992 Freddie Mercury tribute concert at Wembley Stadium happened without John Deacon on bass. Other musicians filled in. The show was magnificent. 72,000 people celebrated Freddie's life and music. John watched from home, saw the celebration, appreciated what Brian and Roger were doing, but knew he'd made the right choice for himself. Over the following years, the pattern continued. Brian and Roger would record new material using old Freddie vocals. Queen would release compilation albums. There would be tours with other singers. The band's music would find new audiences through commercials and movies and Broadway shows. John Deacon participated in none of it. He'd retired from music completely, not just from Queen, but from playing bass guitar at all. He'd put down the instrument the day that string broke and never picked it back up. Friends tried to understand. The music press speculated. Fans wondered. But John never explained publicly. He'd done maybe 1 or 2 interviews in Queen's entire career anyway. Silence had always been his preferred mode of communication. He disappeared into private life with a completeness that seemed impossible for someone who'd been in one of the world's biggest bands. He lived quietly in London with his family, went on walks, avoided recognition, became, as he'd once described himself, just a regular person who happened to have an extraordinary past. The bass guitar with the broken string remained in its case. John never had it repaired, never had the string replaced, just left it exactly as it was the day it broke. According to people close to the situation, that guitar case still exists, still has the broken string. Some say it's in storage somewhere in London. Others claim it ended up at Garden Lodge, Freddie's former home, among the collection of items that Mary Austin has preserved. Wherever it is, that broken string remains unrepaired. A physical manifestation of a partnership that ended not with a final concert or a farewell tour, but with a metallic snap in a quiet room. John Deacon is in his 70s now. He lives the life he apparently always wanted beneath the fame ordinary, private, unremarkable. When people occasionally recognize him on London streets, he's polite but brief. He doesn't give interviews, doesn't attend Queen events, doesn't participate in the ongoing celebration of the band's legacy. Some fans have criticized this choice. They wanted him to keep playing, to honor Freddie's memory by continuing the music, to give them the closure or continuation or whatever it is people need from artists they love. But John Deacon understood something those critics didn't. Some partnerships are so complete that they can't be continued with half the participants missing. Some musical conversations are so specific that when one voice goes silent, the other must too. His choice wasn't about dishonoring Freddie's memory. It was about honoring the unique nature of what they'd created together. The bass lines John Deacon created were designed to support Freddie Mercury's voice specifically. They were answers to Freddie's questions, responses to Freddie's calls, foundation for Freddie's buildings. Without Freddie, those bass lines lost their purpose, not their technical proficiency or their musical quality, their purpose, the reason they existed. So John chose silence, not from bitterness or depression or inability to move forward, from understanding, from respect for what had been, from recognition that some things once ended should not be artificially prolonged. That broken bass string said everything John Deacon couldn't articulate in words. When the voice you've been supporting for 30 years goes silent, the foundation can rest. The conversation has concluded. The work is complete. Brian May and Roger Taylor continued creating music, and there's honor in that choice. They found meaning in keeping Queen alive in new forms. John Deacon found meaning in letting it end, in preserving what was by refusing to pretend it could be replicated or continued or somehow rebuilt with pieces missing. Both choices came from love, just different expressions of the same grief. The story of that broken bass string is a story about knowing when to stop, about understanding that silence can be as powerful as sound, about recognizing that some partnerships are so profound that when they end, trying to continue alone dishonors what made them special. John Deacon played bass guitar for Queen from 1971 to 1991. 20 years of creating foundation for one of rock's most distinctive sounds. Then a string broke, and he walked away. Not from cowardice, not from inability to adapt, from wisdom, from understanding that his role had been to support a specific voice, and when that voice went silent, his purpose ended. The broken string remains broken. John Deacon remains silent. And somehow, in that silence, the partnership between the quiet bass player and the flamboyant frontman continues undisturbed by attempts to recreate what can't be recreated. That's not a sad ending. That's the completion of something that was always meant to be finite. Two people who created something extraordinary together, and when one left, the other had the wisdom and the love and the integrity to say, "This is finished, and it was perfect, and I will not diminish it by trying to continue alone." The bass string broke. John Deacon stopped playing, and in homes around London, in storage facilities and private collections, that 1968 Fender Precision bass sits with its E string still curled and broken, exactly as it was the day it snapped. A monument to a partnership, a symbol of silence chosen deliberately, a broken string that in its brokenness says more about love and loss and loyalty than 1,000 words ever could.